Torrential rain took over a dozen lives and forced thousands to flee here in South Korea. We touch upon this event and more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Tuesday, July 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Weather-related tragic incidents have been making headlines across the globe, and South Korea is not an exception. For more on this, I have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid from the UK, based here in Seoul. Raphael, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio as well. Steven, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Raphael, we will start with you. So let's begin with the callous consequences of the torrential rain here in South Korea that began last week.
Yeah, the scale of the devastation has been quite staggering. According to the latest government figures, I believe 19 people have unfortunately lost their lives, and 9 others are still missing across multiple provinces. And now we're hearing stories emerging, such as in Gapyeong, where a family went camping and got caught up in the flooding. The father's body was recovered, but his wife and child remain missing, whilst one of the teenage sons was rescued by emergency services. We're also seeing massive displacement of people. It's been quite enormous. Over 2,500 people have been displaced from 1,200 households who are basically unable to return home at the moment. They are staying in temporary shelters, such as community centers or schools, basically across 15 provinces. The hardest hit area in Sancheong province in South Gyeongsang province, where 10 people died and 4 people remain missing after landslides and flash floods basically devastated the area. And also beyond the human toll, of course, we have infrastructure damage that has been quite extensive. There have been over 6,700 reported cases of facility damage, everything from flooded homes to collapsed roads. In Osan, I think we saw it was a particularly tragic incident where a retaining wall collapsed, and I think that footage, many people saw it because of the heavy rain, crushing a vehicle under and killing the driver. So overall, it has been quite devastating, and the government is, of course, responding and trying to speed up the recovery efforts, and also allocating emergency funds as well to basically help the people in desperate need at the moment.
Right, indeed. In fact, Steven, the President, he stressed the significance of a greater disaster management framework in light of this latest tragedy. What exactly did he say, and what are the prospects of such a prevention plan, if you will?
Well, he was careful in his wording, and I think the phrase that stuck out to me was he said that this tragedy was reasonably predictable. And I mean, I think what he probably was getting at was that we do see these kinds of heavy rains every year. And I mean, just for me, anecdotally, it seems like the summer in Korea is almost every year we get some kind of weather phenomenon that people describe as unprecedented or extreme, or the worst in history, and that's both extreme heat and really strong periods of concentrated rainfall. And Lee, I think his implication was just that like more could have been done to foresee this, and maybe more preparations could have been put in place to reduce the damage and the loss of lives, which is, I'm sure a goal that everyone would like to pursue. Beyond that, Lee is of course the most powerful official in the country, but when it comes to something like a national planning infrastructure that requires a quite delicate balance of managing the power of the national government, the purview of, to be able to enact things or to pronounce things nationally, but then to also have to implement them on a local level. Korea has a system of provinces and then counties and cities. And to make something like that happen, you would really need to work very closely with the local governments who understand the conditions in their particular areas, who know the people there and who know the weather patterns and who know the predilections of how people are likely to respond. But I mean, I think the takeaway from this is that I would just hope that the weather officials are studying how, not like with a super long historical context because weather is changing so quickly, but like looking at, say, like the last 5 years, like when do rains tend to hit, where do they hit heaviest, what types of topography are the most vulnerable. I mean, I think one variable that we see in Korea is there's a very mountainous landscape, and there are valleys, and there are places where because of the topography, the water can, if a drain is clogged, or if you just see uncommonly heavy rainfall, things can pile up very quickly, and that can create a really dangerous situation. I remember I think it was 2023, if I'm not mistaken, there was the flooding in Gangnam, and there were these like iconic photos of like people sitting on the roofs of cars in Gangnam, and then later on reading up on that and seeing that Gangnam is vulnerable to flooding because it's kind of a little bit below sea level, and it's an area that was customarily not inhabited by a lot of people, but now because so many there and so many other areas of Korea, so much concrete and asphalt and non-absorbent materials have been put in, that there really needs to be a lot of thought put into drainage and disaster relief and all these other things. So I think Lee was, kind of saying what a lot of people are thinking, that it is time for some more kind of comprehensive planning. And the reality is that we can't predict the weather exactly, but we can, I think, reasonably just expect that these types of extreme weather events are going to continue and are going to become even more frequent. So it might make sense to have something like a national control tower, or even like a government ministry who is tasked with preparing for these things and minimizing the damage.
Right, for sure. Raphael, in the meantime, how are pundits explaining this latest tragic event? Are they linking it to broader weather patterns like climate change? What have you been hearing?
Yeah, I think there's been quite a consensus among experts that this represents a fundamental shift or change in South Korea's weather patterns. I think it goes without saying these days that, they say Korea is the country of 4 seasons, but I don't know if that is quite true anymore. We either have very long and cold winter, followed by a spring that lasts maybe a week, and then a very hot summer. Media outlets are describing what's happened over the past few days as monster rainfall. And again, experts are directly linking this to climate change. What's, I think, interesting these days in the media and also among politicians is that there is a change in the wording, like in maybe Western countries as well, where we talk about the climate crisis. And more and more politicians as well as media are using this terminology. Meanwhile, we have Prime Minister Kim Min-sok, who has been blunt about saying that climate change, which we used to talk about in a vague way, has now become the new normal. He's described how Korea now faces these record-breaking heat waves every year, followed almost immediately by what he calls water bomb level downpours. Weather officials point that July's early heat wave might have actually intensified the rains. Even in Gangwon Province's Yeongso region, average temperatures were nearly 4 degrees higher above normal. And there's the basic physics principle where for every degree of warming, the atmosphere can retain or hold about 7% more moisture. So these extreme heat periods are exacerbating or essentially loading the atmosphere with these water bombs, as the Prime Minister put it. I think also Korea's weather prediction system might have been caught off guard. The Korea Meteorological Administration had previously declared the monsoon season as being over, I think on July 1st, but climate scientists are now saying that the traditional concept of the monsoon season, which when I first came here, I understood the monsoon to be basically in June. But now, these days, it's a bit all over the place. I do remember as well, a few years ago, it was 2 or 3 years ago, absolutely pouring down. I think it was in September. more so than the traditional monsoon season. So yeah, this concept of monsoon, I think, might not apply any longer. So we're seeing some calling it maybe primary or secondary rainy periods that don't follow these historical patterns. And then when it comes to the infrastructure, the drainage and sewage systems in this country, they were built to handle 30 to 50 year frequency rainfall, essentially moderate storms that happen every few decades. But now we're seeing what they call 200-year frequency downpours, the kind of extreme rainfall that you would expect that would happen once every 2 centuries. These events are basically happening more and more frequently due to climate change. So even we've reached a point where even the basic infrastructure can't cope with this so-called new normal, as the Prime Minister said.
Right. By the way, Steven, just out of curiosity, are there any challenges faced by the foreign media in covering such natural disasters here in the country?
I'd say there are a few. I'd say the first one is just that when you're talking about going out in the midst of an extreme rainstorm like this, and you're talking about going into the, by definition, if you're covering this as a news story, you're trying to go to some of the more, acutely affected and most kind of urgently coping parts of the country. You're going to face the challenge just in terms of safety, and you're not going to want to do that unless you have a reasonable amount of support. You're probably not going to want to go into one of these areas unless you have a car, and unless you have, I don't know what it necessarily would need to be, a life jacket or raincoat. And you probably wouldn't want to do it by yourself. You probably want to have a team of people, just because things tend to be safer that way. And the reality is just that fewer and fewer media outlets have that have the ability to send teams out into the field, just because it's expensive. And as we all know, the economics of media are changing rapidly, and media outlets are having to cut back on that kind of original reporting. I'd say another one that you might face is just that, as a foreign reporter, you don't have roots, you're not a known quantity. And if Raphael or I were to show up in Chungcheongnam-do tomorrow and want to attend a local briefing, the first questions would be well, who are you? What are you doing here? You're not on our list. You're not in our normal pool of people that we share information with. And that could go any number of ways. They could be glad that you're there, and they could, want to get the word out, and they could appreciate you taking an interest in this, and they could be very helpful. Or they could say, well, we're sorry, the rules of how we operate preclude us from sharing this kind of information with non-accredited reporters. So that's the second one. And just the third one that I would point to is, I would say, as a foreign reporter covering a country for a foreign audience, something that a limitation that you run into all the time is your own editors or your own audience's lack of interest. I mean, this may not be something that a reporter's bosses or a reporter's audience is super interested in, because they would see it as mostly a local story. They would look at, unless it got to a really horrific level, they would look at something like flooding in South Korea as something that it makes sense for people who live in that country, for people who have a kind of direct connection to it, to be interested in. But it's probably not something that a media outlet would see as worthy of devoting a lot of attention or a lot of resources to. And I don't mean that as a criticism, because as any media outlet has to make these kinds of difficult decisions all the time. The world is a big place. There's urgent and important things happening all over the world, and you can't devote tons of time and tons of attention to everything. You have to make these kind of hard choices. But I mean, for reporters who are ambitious and who wanting to put a direct and a human face on this kind of news event, there are limitations that they face, not just in Korea but anywhere. And they come, as I tried to lay out, they come in a few different forms.
Right. Meanwhile, one story, though, Raphael, that the foreign media was interested in was that about the tangible support base that President Lee Jae-myung continues to enjoy, and that was covered by online news magazine The Diplomat. What's your take on this public sentiment, the support that the president continues to enjoy?
Yeah, I think Lee's approval ratings have been quite strong since he's taken office. And in this Diplomat piece, it highlights how his support has actually grown beyond his electoral mandate. He won, if we remember well, the June election with 49% of the vote, but approval ratings have consistently exceeded around 60% over the past few weeks, reaching as high as 64% at one point. And if we look at the latest figures, a recently published Real Meter poll survey shows his approval rating at 62.2%, which is still very solid, I would say, and it represents technically the first decline since taking office by about 2.4 percentage points from the previous week. But also if we look at his Democratic Party, they're doing, I don't know, relatively well, I would say, approval at 50.8%, while the opposition People Power Party have slumped to just 27.4%. And I think, again, if we look at this piece in The Diplomat that highlights what's driving this kind of sustained support, I think ultimately it's Lee's unique path to power. He assumed our office, of course, after Yoon's martial law attempt, and there has been a strong public reaction in favor for his efforts to restore democracy, as he puts it. And even if we look at the resurgent stock market following his election victory, this has basically won over some of the moderates, maybe, who might not have initially voted for him. I think Lee has successfully projected an image of himself as passionate and hardworking, if not overworking, and is very active on social media as well, showing himself going around the country and meeting the people. We're having these town hall meetings as well. There was supposed to be one in Busan last week, but it got cancelled due to the floodings. Yeah, definitely more connected with the people. It seems to be the kind of image that he wants to project. I guess it makes it difficult for many people to criticize his leadership per se at this moment in time. And with his party controlling the National Assembly, they have been able to quickly move to investigate the previous administration and allegations of corruption, whether it's with Mr. Yoon or his wife. And I think many people seem to be satisfied with that. Of course, there will be people who don't like that. There was a recent dip, as I mentioned, in his approval ratings this week by just a few percentage points. Probably not too much to be worried about for now, but I think, of course, this suggests that he is in this honeymoon period. He is doing quite strong, but at the same time, he is not immune to the typical pressures that will follow or haunt any administration, whether it's this one or any previous administration.
Right. And beyond his domestic agenda, President Lee Jae-myung's officials were in Osaka recently for a trilateral meeting with Japanese officials and their U.S. counterparts to reaffirm their commitment to the trilateral partnership among Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular meeting and its implications, Steven?
Well, I think you got to the most important bit of it there, was that they reaffirmed their commitment to trilateral cooperation. So in that sense, it's more of the same, but I'm going to try to make the case that simply stating that is, given the current context, is actually more significant than it usually is. So just to be a bit more specific, they said that they remain committed to the complete denuclearization of North Korea, and that they are quite alarmed by its increasing military cooperation with Russia, and that they agree to continue strengthening their deterrence on the trilateral level. And so I would say that, on one sense, just looking at the wording that they use, like, that's no change from the previous positions that they've reiterated in previous encounters. So there's nothing new there, but I would say that given how much has changed in recent months in the politics of all three of those countries, it is significant in that there's no apparent change in what, under the previous administrations on all those countries, was a quite new and a quite stepped up level of trilateral cooperation. So, I mean, it is interesting that even though South Korea and the U.S. and Japan in the U.S. on a bilateral level are experiencing some tensions now over trade, both Seoul and Tokyo are endeavoring to get exemptions from the U.S. over these tariffs, that's the so-called reciprocal tariffs that are scheduled to take full effect quite soon. despite that going on, and despite some tensions in these customary alliances on the security side of things, they're still saying all the same things, and they still appear committed to the same principles. Nobody is kind of rocking the boat too much on that side of things. So, I mean, like I tried to allude to earlier, like that is interesting when you look at, there's been, of course, a change of power in the United States. There's been a change of power in South Korea. Just over the weekend, there were some elections in Japan that perhaps portend some changes in like what we've all kind of gotten used to as a very, whatever the opposite of dynamic is, very kind of stable, very kind of staid political culture, where one political party has an almost de facto kind of stranglehold on how things work. We've seen things get shaken up there, and there's a bit of uncertainty. But so my point is just that on these key security issues, I think it's noteworthy that they, despite all of this change in other areas, they seem to still be on the same page there.
Right. And with regard to Mr. Trump's tariffs, Raphael, that Steven mentioned earlier, National Security Advisor Lee Myungbak is back in the U.S. for talks with officials there. What has been shared about his agenda?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Lee Myungbak's departure, I mean, it's his second trip to Washington in just 11 days. So I think this gives you a sense of how urgent these negotiations have become for this administration. The tariff deadline is, of course, the 1st of August, set by Trump. So I think that's just about a week away, if my math doesn't fail me. So it's basically crunch time at the moment. And Lee has been very candid about his objective. Just before leaving Seoul, he told reporters that his goal was to reduce the tariff by a few percentage points and see if there would be any additional benefits Korea could secure or extract beyond that. He's also expected, of course, to meet again with his counterpart, Marco Rubio. But he isn't going alone this time for the final push. There's essentially been a parade of Korean officials heading to Washington this week, and we're seeing the finance minister, the trade minister, basically joining forces, and I believe the foreign minister is also going to be arranging a trip to the US later this week. There's even talk of a special business delegation led by former Tusan Group chairman, departing, I believe, on Thursday. So I think this strategy appears to be what officials are calling a kind of package deal approach, linking trade concessions with security cooperation and broader alliance issues. And we actually proposed that President Lee Jae-myung hold a summit with President Trump. Apparently, Rubio expressed some support for the idea during their previous meeting. Could it happen sooner than later, or pre-APEC summit later at the end of October? Who knows? But this is kind of a coordinated diplomatic offensive that represents the restoration of the so-called 2+2 high-level consultancy body between the finance and trade ministers, and this has been suspended since April. So I think Korean officials seem to view this as their basically last realistic chance to avoid the full 25% tariffs implemented or at least threatened by the Trump administration.
Right, set to go into effect by August 1st, I believe. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Raphael, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Steven, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow.